Hello, and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Alex Ross, author of The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century. Alex, who is music critic of The New Yorker, won last year's Guardian First Book Prize for this history of 20th century classical music. It has been a great critical and commercial success on both sides of the Atlantic. Björk called it incredibly nourishing and likely to rekindle anyone's fire for music, while pianist Emmanuel Ax found it beautiful, passionate, witty, and utterly compelling. What readers have especially liked is the way in which Alex shows how bigger historical forces shaped what was going on in the lives and works of composers. Talking to me from his home in New York, Alex told me about making the links between history and music.
Yeah, this was absolutely essential to the idea of the book from the beginning. And really, when I first discovered 20th century classical music in college, at the same time I was heavily into studying history, European history especially. And so it was all very much woven together in my mind, the lives of these composers and the extraordinary chaotic events that were unfolding around them. So when I came to conceive the book, I really wanted to write not just about the music, but to use the music as a way of listening, as I say in the subtitle, to the century itself. And I think there's several good reasons to do this. First, I just find it an intellectually satisfying and provocative way of writing about music, and not simply to analyze the sounds themselves, but to see what was going on around them. And secondly, I find that for those coming to this music for the first time, it helps a great deal to realize what pressures were bearing down on the composers, on a man such as Shostakovich living through Stalin's terror, or Aaron Copland writing his populist masterpieces during the period of the New Deal in America, and then reacting to the Red Scares of the 1950s, and then the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy period, and so many other forces acting upon the music. I think it helps to understand why there is this drastic variety of sounds in the century, and why there's some very sharp swerves as composers moved from one decade to another, because the world around them was changing so fast.
You open the book that the literal curtain raiser is Richard Strauss's opera Salome, which was first performed in 1906 in Graz in Austria. Can you say why you chose that particular event to start the book?
One reason was that I just find Salome to be a fascinating piece of music, a very ambiguous piece of music. Some aspects of it can be considered very modern, very revolutionary for their time. In other ways, it looks back to the Romantic period, to Wagner, and that ambiguity, I think, makes it a good microcosm of what happened in the whole 20th century, where there were some composers who were seeking new sounds and constantly innovating, and others who were not great revolutionaries, but who also wrote very valuable music, such as Benjamin Britten and Aaron Copland and so on. So I sort of wanted to send the signal at the outset that when I was talking about the 20th century, I wouldn't be focusing just on the revolutionaries and innovators, but also paying attention to a lot of music that didn't necessarily fit that narrative. And I also was fascinated by this particular performance because of the cast of characters that showed up for it. Mahler, Puccini, Schoenberg, and all his students. And there was the story that the teenage Hitler came from Vienna to see the opera, so he claimed to Strauss's son many years later. And for a book that was going to intermingle the stories of music and history, this was a rather irresistible place to start with. The idea that the teenage Hitler may have been lurking somewhere in the back of the scene.
You've already mentioned the Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich, and he really occurs as a sort of pivotal figure in the book, it seemed to me, both in terms of the chronology of it and being, I suppose, a sort of quintessential 20th century artist and having to deal with the forces of history and totalitarianism and reach some accommodation. I wondered if you saw him in a sort of pivotal role.
Yeah, I think he is very close to the center of the book, in that his life gives you in such a dramatic, hair-raising way this my central theme of composers faced with the rapid moving tides of history, and this picture of Shostakovich sitting in his apartment, and the phone rings, and it's Stalin on the line. He begins stammering out a conversation, and actually ends up negotiating with Stalin about the terms of this trip to America that the dictator wanted him to take. And despite his natural shyness and his fear of confrontation and mixing himself up in circumstances beyond his control, Shostakovich did end up more or less demanding that certain of his works and the works of other major composers would be taken off a list. They had been banned, and Stalin pretended not to know that this had been done, but the ban ended up being lifted. So these remarkable moments at which Shostakovich was, sometimes almost negotiating for his life, other times negotiating for his freedom, for a partial freedom to pursue his creative path. And you could see it almost as a metaphor for the predicament that composers faced all over the world, whether or not they were living in the midst of totalitarian terror. There was this problem of the mainstream audience and what wider audiences wanted to hear, and commercial pressures, and the pressures of the marketplace, and then how do you retain your individuality in a world that is so commercialized and so dominated by trends. And I think actually to a remarkable degree, this book, despite the horror of a lot of the events, tells a rather optimistic story, or sort of a surprisingly encouraging story of survival and of a sort of heroic resistance on the part of a lot of composers to those pressures.